Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. I'm joined by Sheldon Richmond. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show, as you know, that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. Sheldon, news report just came out in the last couple of days about Cuba, which I consider the decades-long obsession of the U.S. national security state, which consists primarily of the CIA and the U.S. military. The report shows implicitly that the Cold War never ended for the U.S. government, especially the national security state. That what they've been doing is recruiting young people, young Latin Americans, through the USAID. Now, they're claiming that it was a USAID project, but as we all know, the USAID is oftentimes a front for the CIA, which has long been obsessed with regime change in Cuba ever since Castro took power. And they've recruited these young people, young Latin Americans, to go into Cuba and start fomenting dissent and finding people that are anti-Castro and try to organize, secretly, because it's against the law, dissent against Castro, risking the lives of these people, and it just came out. It doesn't seem like any of the young people were arrested. It looks like they got out, but who knows? I'm not sure you can really rely on the CIA or USAID to tell the truth. But certainly the article said they were close calls. Now, this is absolutely inane. This is the Cold War mindset, the idea of regime change that goes all the way back to the Bay of Pigs invasion, the repeated assassination attempts against Castro, the terrorist activities, the cruel and brutal embargo that's gone on against Cuba. Recently, there was another Twitter campaign, surreptitious campaign called Zunzeo. And now this. When does it finally stop, Sheldon? When does this obsession with regime change in Cuba finally come to an end?
Yeah, I saw that story as an Associated Press investigation. So I saw the AP story on my front page of my local paper on Monday and just yesterday. And as I kind of quipped in my upcoming article on this, I thought I had woken up and I had a Twilight Zone moment. I thought I woke up in 1961, where they're reporting this covert attempt to foment revolution in Cuba with the use of undercover, people undercover. And then I realized, no, it's 2014, and they're not talking about Kennedy or Johnson. They're talking about Obama and Secretary of State Clinton, because this began in 2009, ran for at least 2 years, according to the AP. So shortly after Obama takes office, this begins. You'd think that after all the revelations that have come out about U.S. conduct toward Cuba, from 61 to 65 roughly, or 60 to 65, specifically the assassination attempts and other silly things, and using the mafia to get Castro, and sending him exploding cigars, and putting something in his food, I guess, that would make his beard fall out. I mean, all kinds of like the Keystone Cops. You'd think Obama wouldn't be interested in such a thing in this day and age. After all, it's 2014, and he's supposedly more enlightened on this, and wants to leave these old ways behind. But clearly, they didn't leave the old ways behind. The American rulers have always had their eyes on Cuba. I mean, from day one, the founders were assuming one day Cuba would fall into their hands. If they waited, they didn't even think they'd need to go to a war with Spain. They figured Spain would eventually leave the hemisphere and Cuba would fall into their laps. But they believed that Cuba was part of manifest destiny. Now, of course, U.S. didn't acquire Cuba really until 1896, when I went to war against Spain. So they didn't get it without war. And then, eventually they've had friendly regimes in there through Batista, and then Castro comes to power in 59. And you're right, the American rulers were obsessed with Cuba. And of course, you had the Soviet angle, Cuban Missile Crisis, and all that stuff. A lot of mythology around that. So here they are in 2014, where long after the Soviet Union has imploded, you don't hear about Russia sending anything into Cuba as trade with Cuba, between Russia and Cuba, but they're not sending missiles or military or anything of that sort. So why this obsession? And why are they sticking to the embargo after all these years, which only gives Raul Castro, now Fidel's successor as president, or whatever his title is, gives him an excuse to explain the economic hardship. They just blame the United States for the embargo. It's worked perfectly well for all these years, over 50 years. I don't know what the heck they were thinking. It seems to me if you really want to try to liberate Cuba, the best way would be to just totally open up exchange with Cuba of all kinds, because as the Foundation for Economic Education people used to point out in the 50s, with trade comes ideas. And the best way to introduce liberal ideas into a country that is sort of closed to them is to engage them in trade, because that means people going over, and then you get exchanges that go far beyond the material goods that are being traded.
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of Americans never really give much thought to what the embargo really is. It's a control on the American people. And so here they're objecting to Castro because of his socialism, which is a philosophy that calls for government control over economic activity, private property, and so forth, ownership or control. And so how do they combat it? With government control over economic activity for the American people. I mean, you couldn't find a clearer example of an infringement on the fundamental right of economic liberty than this embargo. If an American travels to Cuba and spends money there without permission, you see, it's okay if you get permission from the government, but if you don't get permission, they will prosecute you, and they have prosecuted people, and they will try to put you in jail for spending your money in a way that they haven't approved of. And so here, in order to fight socialism, they end up adopting this socialist program that's really a control on the American people. And yeah, let's go back a little bit. I mean, you know, you've got the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. tells the Cubans, we're going to come and help liberate you from Spanish rule. It said the same thing to the Philippines. And as soon as the U.S. beats this decrepit empire, the Spanish Empire, it takes its place and says, well, no, now Cuba belongs to us, and the Philippines belong to us. So you've got that famous Platt Amendment to the Cuban Constitution, which says that effectively your rulers are subject to our consent. That was to ensure that we'd have a puppet there. And in the Philippines, they refused to go along with anything like that. So you had this violent insurrection where the U.S. ends up massacring tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Filipinos. But over here in Cuba, you've got a succession of puppets, culminating with Fulgencio Batista. It's that same kind of system that exists today, that as long as Batista was our guy and he would do our bidding in the United Nations, support whatever our government was doing, he would have free reign to establish any kind of tyranny he wanted in Cuba, sort of like the relationship between the Egyptian regime and the U.S. regime today. Well, Castro comes in and ousts a guy, and yeah, I've always suspected that it wasn't really so much his socialism that U.S. officials objected to, but the fact that he refused to bend his knee to the U.S. I think that if he had bent the knee and said, tell me what you want me to do in the United Nations and I'll support your foreign policies, I don't think they would have cared what he did in Cuba. But he refused to do that. And the other interesting, ironic thing economically is that, you know, they've always said that what they did was justified because of Castro's belief in communism or socialism. But notice something, Sheldon. Cuba has never attacked the United States, never even attempted to attack the United States. No terrorism, no assassination attempts. And yet we've been inculcated with this mindset since kids from the first grade that the CIA and the military are entirely justified in trying to kill Castro, invade that island, and whatever. Where does that justification come from? Because the guy happens to believe in a certain philosophy? Because he certainly never aggressed against the United States. Since the very beginning, the U.S. has been the aggressor with the embargo, the invasion at the Bay of Pigs, the assassination attempts. There's no warrant for that in the Constitution. There's no warrant for it, morally speaking, to be killing people because of the mindsets that they happen to hold or the economic system they happen to put in their country. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to harp on with respect to the Americans, to break through this notion that because a people have put into power or because a dictator has taken the reins of power that happens to hold a different economic philosophy, that automatically subjects him to the power, the deadly power of the U.S. national security state. And that's why I continue to maintain that we've got to question not only the policies, but the entire structure, the giant standing military, the CIA, the whole apparatus that we know is the national security state.
Yeah, I think you can trace it back, and you can go back earlier than this, but most formally in the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine said to all outsiders, the Western Hemisphere is ours. So, be on guard. They always expected that Cuba would become somehow part of America. I'm not saying it would be a state necessarily, but a possession. In 1898, when the U.S. government went to war against Spain, I mean, Cuba wasn't a communist country. It simply was a possession of an European power, and we had already told the Europeans we're going to be the only big boys in this hemisphere. So that was part of the reason for the war. As you recall, there was the supposed attack on the ship, the Maine, the battleship, the Maine, which I guess historians regard as having been a boiler that exploded. But with the help of William Randolph Hearst's newspapers, war was whipped up. Remember the Maine, and that this was a terrorist attack. So the things don't change that much, and they finally came into possession of Cuba. Then they lost it with Castro and his close relationship to Russia. And so again, they could have invoked the Monroe Doctrine by saying Russia's an outside power. It's a European power, part of it. It's Eurasian, but we've already published a doctrine that says no European power can have possessions in our hemisphere. So, I mean, I see it as one long historical line there, and had a new guise with communism. But I'm not sure communism was the relevant issue there. I think it was that it was a power from outside of the hemisphere, and it was not American. So it's funny. I mean, getting back to the particulars of this AP story, and it was their own investigation. This was not coming from a single leak, I guess. Somehow they don't really say how they initially got the word of it, but they talk about how barely trained these young Latin Americans were that were sent in to pose as tourists and even medical workers. They were not trained in covert activities. They knew they were sending them into a dangerous place. That USID contractor by the name of Gross, who's still in prison, had recently, around that time, was taken. And they had a manual. They put out a manual for these operatives, telling them, well, we don't want to overstate the case, but it's really not very dangerous where you're going, because Cuba would not want the bad publicity of beating a foreigner that arrested them. That's the way they put them at ease. They said, don't worry, Cuba probably won't want the bad publicity of beating up foreigners, so you're probably safe. Of course, this guy Gross has been in jail for several years. His health was failing. So it's almost comical. So this Keystone Cops idea, this sort of theme of bumblers, it continues up to the present day. That's what's so astounding about this. Well, not present. I guess they've ended this program, but it may be happening other places. We know they were doing so covert stuff in Ukraine just this year. And they did engineer a regime change in Ukraine through the National Endowment for Democracy. So they never learned anything. And I guess if you don't have an incentive to learn, then you don't learn. So that explains it.
No, I think it goes back. I mean, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I think it goes back to this idea that they're just obsessed with regime change around the world, trying to get their people in public office who will be their puppets. And your point about Obama really is a fascinating one, because Obama switched gears on this one. He also switched gears on the whole idea of the war on terrorism and civil liberties, and he really abandoned his leftist base that he had promised that he would restore civil liberties. And I think there's the possibility here that people are underestimating the power that the Pentagon and the CIA have in this country. That we automatically assume that the president's in charge, that they work for him, and that they're going to do what he tells them to do. I think we underestimate the power of this what I think is effectively now the fourth branch of government. That when we left the giant standing military after World War II in existence to fight the Cold War, whatever that term meant, the Cold War against America's World War II partner and ally, the Soviet Union, that we were going to defend the world against communism. And so you leave this huge apparatus with an empire of foreign military bases in existence. You bring into existence the CIA and the NSA, and you've got this giant apparatus that very shortly President Eisenhower would warn the American people about in his farewell address in 60. He says, "Beware the military-industrial complex. It is a grave threat to our democratic processes." And he was serious about it. And then Kennedy comes in, and they immediately pressure him into doing the Bay of Pigs invasion. So I think that we can't underestimate the power of this force within the government to bend presidents to their will, that say, this is what we want, this is our policy, and you need to go along with us. Sort of like a co-equal branch of government where they have to bend a little bit too, but where they're now a major player in the direction this government's taking. And let's face it, in my opinion, the CIA has never gotten over the humiliation at the Bay of Pigs. When the Cold War officially ended, I think one of the main reasons that the embargo stayed in place was because of the national security apparatus that said, hey, how can the Cold War end when our old nemesis is still in power there? And so a lot of people think, oh, well, no, it's the Cuban Americans in Florida that prevent the embargo from being lifted. I think it's more that the CIA and the military won't let it be lifted because they want a surrender. They want to bring a regime change or a defeat. And that's why you have this little scheme going on right now with recruiting these young people. As you point out, despite the fact that Alan Gross is spending several years in a Cuban penitentiary for trying to foment or supposedly fomenting dissent through communications and so forth. There's that Zunzeo plan, which was another Keystone Cop plan. It was a Twitter scheme that USAID, which I think was CIA, that they concocted to foment dissent among Cuba's young people. I mean, it never stops for the U.S. national security state. And my hunch is that at the very beginning, Obama just said, whatever you want, you got it. Just stop pressuring me. I'll go along with it.
Yeah, because what we won't know until maybe many years later if someone gets the inside scoop. Hillary Clinton, I've read, though, is entirely enthusiastic about making the State Department very close to the Defense Department and working together in a way that really was not common previously. The State Department often was very turf jealous and didn't like getting too close to the Defense Department, thinking that this would subordinate that department to defense. But Hillary, as I've read, I believe on Consortium News, was quite a enthusiast for this and worked very closely. So I'm not sure it needs to be an independent fourth branch. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm about this. Obama doesn't really strike me as someone who would take a principled position against it. So we won't know. Hopefully our archives someday will be opened up and we'll find out more. I think the political aspects of Florida and the Cuban embargo are very important. I don't know how to rank it versus something else, but it is politically important. Florida's important to Republicans, and it's important to Democrats to deprive Republicans of Florida. We saw that in 2000. And so there was that generation of Cuban Americans in South Florida that was an important voting bloc, and they didn't want to hear anything about ending the embargo. Castro was the devil, and you couldn't say anything. Now that was a couple of generations ago. I mean, they're still alive; they're getting older, And you have new generations coming along that, as far as I read, don't care as much about it. So there may be some shifting there, and perhaps some hope for ending this embargo finally. But I agree with you. It does come across as an obsession. It seems oblivious to consequences. It seems, very obvious to me, or very plausible, that the Castros could keep pointing to the embargo as an explanation for the hardship there. And most people aren't economists and aren't going to know what's the problem with that argument. But I don't know why they don't get through their thick heads, the Americans, that is, that this just looks ridiculous to the rest of the world, and it should have ended a long time ago.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, Castro uses this as the excuse. I mean, obviously his socialist system has just left people impoverished. But the Cuban people are being squeezed off two sides of a vice. One side's the socialist system and the other side's the embargo. And but Castro blames it all on the embargo. It provides him the perfect excuse to say, oh, the reason you're suffering is not because of our socialism, it's because of the embargo. If the embargo weren't here, we would be enjoying, great prosperity. And so you're right. It gives the Castro regime the ability to blame it on the embargo, when really that's only half the problem. And on the Florida thing that you were talking about, my impression is the latest public opinion polls there say that a majority of people in that area, I don't know whether the poll was all of the Miami area or the Cuban American sector, but that they now favor a lifting of the embargo, which the article said is a major shift taking place. Maybe a lot of the old people from the time of the 60s are passing away, and the young people are more receptive to just opening up things. Because as you point out, I mean, what better way to combat a tyrannical regime than to have a bunch of American tourists and businessmen flooding in there with ideas and books and discussion and philosophy and money. I mean, because sometimes the best counteraction to a tyrannical regime is a prosperous middle class that can act as a counterweight to the tyranny. When everybody's impoverished and everybody works for the state or derives his income from the state, everybody has to be good and compliant. And finally, let me mention also that the idea of Guantanamo Bay. I mean, a lot of people don't realize how it is that America has a military base in this communist country. And it was acquired as part of this outgrowth of the Spanish-American War when they were renegotiating the Platt Amendment, which the Cubans wanted dropped from their constitution, which required them to subject their rulers to U.S. approval. The U.S. said, well, give us Guantanamo Bay and we'll drop the Platt Amendment. And so they get this long-term lease, which is effectively just a permanent ownership at some nominal amount. I forget what the amount is, a few $1,000s a year. And they just stole it. I mean, it was just essentially the U.S. government moving into the area of empire and imperialism, acquired this base. And then look at what the base is being used for. And a constitution-free zone. That was the original idea of the prisoner base at Guantanamo Bay. The Pentagon didn't want to be constrained by the Constitution because they didn't believe in the Constitution. So they said, we're going to have our base here in this communist country, and ironically adopted most of the procedures in their, quote, judicial system that Castro uses over on the communist side of the island. Torture, indefinite detention, no trials, keeping people in prison for 10 whatever years without trial. I mean, it'd be difficult to tell the difference between the system that the Pentagon's using at Guantanamo Bay and the system that Castro uses in his court system. And what a disgrace. So, yeah, I think the whole thing needs to be questioned here. Guantanamo Bay, the regime change operations, the embargo on Americans, just lift it. Just leave Cuba alone as far as the government's concerned and liberate the American people to interact and trade and tour. It seems so clear to me, Sheldon. How come other people can't get it?
Yeah, and I hope if Hillary Clinton decides she wants to run for president, I hope she's going to get asked about this by people who consider themselves progressives. Although progressives, I guess, were all for the Spanish-American War and World War I. but so they're not, don't exactly have a record of being anti-war, at least the Eastern progressives. I hope she gets questions about this. I don't know if she addresses it in her memoir that came out recently, but there are a lot of things to ask her. But this is a good one. I mean, this happened during her first year as Secretary of State. Assume she was in on it, and I would love to see her defend this covert activity, because it's such a throwback to days that they would repudiate if you asked them outright. Well, what do you think of all the covert activity in the 60s and 70s up until the church committee revelations? I presume they'd say for the public that they think it's terrible. They'd never engage in that kind of activity. It's a thing from the past, and a stain on America and all this stuff. And here they are doing something very similar. I hope Jake Tapper and all you guys out there put the question to Hillary. Was she involved in this? Did she sign off on it? Did she complain about it, behind closed doors? I want to know the answer.
I hope so too, because so many of these politicians have been involved in this thing. And there's a lot of fundamental questions to be asked. Is why aren't Americans free to spend their own money the way they want? Isn't that what freedom encompasses? And really, it's a restriction on travel. I mean, in the U.S., the only reason the U.S. hasn't put a formal prohibition on travel to Cuba is because they want to be able to preach to the world that they believe in freedom of travel. So they do this thing surreptitiously with the imposition of spending money there. So it's okay to go to Cuba because the U.S. believes in freedom of travel. You just can't spend money there, because as soon as you do that, they prosecute you. And then all of these regime change operations going back, as you say, to the 60s, the assassination attempts. I mean, some of them are Keystone Cops, but make no mistake about it. They were trying to kill people there, and namely Fidel Castro. And my question is under what authority did they do that? I mean, just because the man believes in communism, because he believes in socialism? I mean, that's what the Pinochet regime, which is another target of a regime change operation by the CIA and the Pentagon. Pinochet was killing people because they believed in socialism and communism, not because they were violently resisting the military tyranny, but because of something that they believed in their mind. They felt that authorized them, the Cold War authorized them to kill people. I find that just totally morally repugnant. I mean, I'm a libertarian. Nobody's going to be able to stand up to a libertarian and with respect to socialism. We abhor socialism and all the socialist programs. But we would defend the right of people to believe in socialism. I mean, that's part of freedom too, even though we disagree with the philosophy. Their position was in Chile and in Cuba that if a person believes in socialism, they have the authority to kill him. And it's that repugnant mindset that I don't think Americans have really confronted. What really happened in Chile, which was done in full partnership with the U.S. as part of that regime change operation 10 years after the failed Bay of Pigs, and it was what all of the regime change operations in Cuba were about. The idea that that the U.S. national security state can go after people, can go after regimes because they happen to hold a different economic or political philosophy. And I think that's got to be the subject of real discussion in this country. When you talk about Hillary running for president and all the other presidential candidates, let's get down to fundamentals. Under what moral and legal authority do you wage this constant war against the Cuban people and against the people of the world, really, that happen to elect leaders that the U.S. doesn't approve of?
Yeah, well, I guess they would say there are inherent national security powers in the presidency. That's what they used to say during the Bush years, that they're already there in the executive power. I think what goes beyond even just the ideas in their head, the fact that, say, Fidel Castro would have said he subscribed to, revolutionary Marxism, is more what they do, not so much what they think. But in other words, they're not going to conduct the country in line with what the American rulers believe is America's economic interest, which usually comes down to particular special interests. So, Cuba was, and then as we know from Smedley Butler, Latin America was a cash cow for American firms. So a country which is going to break away from that, even if it was unaligned and didn't embrace the Soviet Union or take any aid or anything from the Soviet Union, would still be intolerable no matter what philosophy the leader of that country espoused. The fact is he was taking his country on an independent course and wasn't going to just do corporate bidding of big companies that were close to the American politicians. And the Dulles brothers, who came out of private firms, which represented a private firm that represented large companies. That was what was intolerable. Taking the country, making the country unaligned and not basically a slave to American economic dictates. I suppose if you kept doing that but espoused communism, U.S. would have left you alone as long as you're still serving the economic interests. I guess we don't have a good laboratory experiment of that case, though.
No, but you see all the pro-U.S. dictators. I mean, look at Iran, where they kept the Shah in power, and they ousted Mossadegh because he wasn't aligned with the U.S. And their assassination attempts against foreign leaders like Patrice Lumumba, people that said we don't want to take sides in the Cold War. And the U.S. took the position, if you're not taking our side, then that means you're a communist, and that subjects you to assassination. And so they got rid of Lumumba. And we see this time and time again. We see it, the regime change operation in Chile. We see that what's going on with Cuba to this very day. This is the type of thing that I'm hoping, as you do, that is the subject of a presidential debate and discussion, instead of just tinkering around the edges about how to manage the warfare state. Hopefully there will be fundamental issues of what do we need a warfare state for? Look at the horrible things it's done. Look at the adverse consequences on Americans, especially the loss of our freedom and privacy at the hands of our own government, which is what the founders said would happen if we permitted this kind of enormous Big Brother apparatus to come into existence. Anyway, that's the show for this week, The Libertarian Angle. I'm Jacob Hornberger with Sheldon Richmond, and we'll see you next time.